Thank you. Well, to begin, muy buenas tardes a todos. Me llamo Gregorio Gonzales y soy Genízaro de una comunidad Genízaro de Ranchos de Taos, Nuevo Mexico. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gregorio Gonzales. I'm Genízaro from a Genízaro community located in Ranchos de Taos, New Mexico. And first and foremost, I just want to thank the School for Advanced Research, as well as my fellow resident scholars and my family for this opportunity to share this space, this really rather phenomenal space. It's just, I'm very blessed and very humbled and very honored to be here. So thank you. To get right into it, I titled my talk, Si Eres Genízaro, Recognition, Belonging, and Genízaro Indigeneity in Northern New Mexico. And so I kind of casted a rather broad net in terms of what I'm wanting to talk about, because the work that I'm doing here at SAR is I'm writing my dissertation here, which, to give a kind of a brief overview, is essentially looking at the politics and conditions of indigeneity in Northern New Mexico, and particularly how that discussion plays out, and rather through the lens of Genízaro, both Genízaro identity discourse as well as Genízaro indigeneity and its expression and its articulations within Genízaro communities located in the Taos and Rio Chama valleys. So in this way, it's a very broad project, but I'm very honored and blessed to be able to work with elders both in the Pueblo of Abiquiu as well as in Ranchos de Taos, where I'm from. So I guess to start off here, the themes that I'm wanting to talk about here, I guess we want to call them two conceptual signposts. It's kind of recognition and belonging, and to do that through the lens of Genízaro identity. So I guess before I even kind of get into those rather interesting spaces, I feel like I need to be the good anthropological, as Renato Rosaldo would call us, and kind of talk about the spaces in which I'm working. And so in particular, talking about Genízaro identity. Now, I'm not going to define it, and I refuse to define it, but rather I believe it is imperative that we understand its intellectual origins in order to understand what its legacies are here in Northern New Mexico. So to begin, Genízaro is actually a Hispanicized version of a Turkish word. It's Yenicheri. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it is. So it's not indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. In fact, it is a Turkish word and was utilized by the Ottoman Empire to identify young Christian boys who were taken captive and then sold in, or actually taken captive and drafted, rather, into the imperial armies of the Ottoman Empire. And these young boys ended up becoming kind of the elite troops of the imperial armies, to the point where they were used as kind of the elite guard for the sultans of the Ottoman Empire. So I think this would be a rather great sociolinguistic project, but to trace how it travels. But needless to say, it does travel from the Mediterranean and probably through the Iberian Peninsula, then through New Spain and up to northern New Mexico. But in northern New Mexico, it takes on a very different context, where you have Spanish colonial administrators and church officials utilizing it as a term to identify primarily native women and children who are being taken captive and then baptized and then sold into a rather robust slave trade that existed here in northern New Mexico throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. And so in this way, Genízaro was actually, its initial origins in northern New Mexico was actually used as an identifier. So it was used to identify native women and native children. So in this way, if there was a Dene woman and she was sold in Abiquiu, instead of being Dene and having her clan relations, she became Maria de la Luz Gallegos. Or Paiute boy, became Jose Ignacio Martinez. So there was a transformation that occurs within Spanish colonial documents and church records, because we have to remember that a lot of times these operated one and the same. They operated in tandem with one another. But even though it starts off as an identifier, something happens in the 1700s where people start articulating, both individually and collectively, as an indigenous subject position in relation to the Spanish crown. And primarily, you'd have these articulations being done within the courts. So in one case, there was Genízaro women who actually took their patron or took their master to court and utilizing kind of these Spanish social mores as a process to actually emancipate themselves from that enslavement. In another case, you have in the courts, as well as it being used as for land petitions. A lot of times these they weren't successful, but the fact that they're articulating it as an indigenous subject position in relation to the Spanish crown is important. It is important because it shows that Genízaro indigeneity was starting to be utilized as an indigenous subject position alongside our pueblo primos. So you would have Genízaros accessing political and legal spaces that were created by the Spanish crown for indigenous peoples, including what pueblos would use. But in this case, Genízaros were utilizing them as Genízaros, not as in any other spaces other than within Genízaro communal and individual contexts. But that kind of resurgence in terms of not only looking at it through these lenses of repatriation and through lenses of communal landholdings, it becomes to the point where Genízaro identity it picks up rather quickly, where you have, because of Spanish colonial policy with the Bourbon reforms that happened, so they make their way here to northern New Mexico, and essentially you have these buffer communities. So a lot of communities today is historically founded by Genízaros. So Belén, Tomé, San Miguel del Vado, of course, the Pueblo of Abiquiu and Ranchos de Taos. So, but they were used. So the only way that Genízaros could have any sort of access to either communal landholdings or just to be able to have their own space was intimately connected through violence. Genízaros could only exist in their own spaces by having to fight against our kin. And so in this way, Genízaro identity kind of moves past this idea of indigenous servitude, where you actually have Genízaros as indigenous settlers and as well as military scouts. So it encompasses such a broad sort of spectrum of what we want to think about as kind of indigenous power relations, as well as kind of negotiating these rather fluid spaces in terms of colonial administration, as well as again within indigenous peoples. But then in 1821, the Plan de Iguala happened, so Mexican independence from Spain, and so it's todos somos mexicanos, we're all Mexican, all equal before the law, and so Mexican administrators in Mexico City decide that Genízaro identity is not a cultural identity or a political identity or a legal identity, but rather it's a caste term. And so because it was considered a caste term, the crown, or rather, excuse me, the kind of the fledgling Mexican nation state decides to say, well, then we need to get rid of it. We need to get rid of it. So essentially, Genízaros vanish from the administrative narrative of New Mexico. Except that you had very vociferous sorts of articulations coming out of the Pueblo of Abiquiu, as well as in other spaces where I think a lot of historians and archaeologists and anthropologists have really invested in this narrative of, well, if we don't find them in the Mexican censuses, then they don't exist. And yet you have within this very robust kind of archival spaces, you have Genízaros articulating Genízaro subject positions in relation to the Department of New Mexico at this time, since New Mexico wasn't a state in Mexico like it was, like Coahuila or Chihuahua. But fast forward to today, like I said, a lot of historians and archaeologists and anthropologists have kind of invested in this to the point where they've kind of built rather successful careers on arguing that Genízaros are simply detribalized, Hispanicized Indians, effectively saying that Genízaros can only exist in a historical presence and they cannot exist today. So with that kind of framing in mind, I'm going to get to my first conceptual signpost here and talk about recognition. Now, this is something I think, like Michael was talking about here. I had a really phenomenal opportunity to go to New York and study with Jay Bernstein and take a seminar with him on Hegel, on Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit. And this is a text that a lot of native scholars and sociocultural anthropologists are really starting to re-engage with in a really productive way. And so this is kind of my engagement with that line of scholarship. But I guess if we want to talk about recognition, Hegel uses it through the master-slave dialectic. So essentially, he uses it as the master-slave as these social roles to talk about essentially a social structure of co-constitutive permanence, rather, where essentially it's a conceptual metaphor for exploring the inherent interdependence between, or rather, interdependence for social existence itself, whether we're talking about it on an individual or a collective level. So that's a rather broad idea. But I guess the way we can think about it is, I exist because you recognize my existence, thereby consolidating and crystallizing your existence by recognizing mine. So what Hegel's essentially looking at is he's trying to figure out how this idea of recognition, so of social presence, is itself it's relational, how it operates in these spaces that it's not just kind of these inherent like silos of being, but instead how it operates in this really complex social space that is continuously being negotiated. So in order to read through that, I actually have been drawing a lot from another Hegelian, Judith Butler, who talks about it through the lens of cultural intelligibility, which she calls as a normative framework that conditions who can be recognized as a legitimate subject, that is a livable life that's conditioned on its capacity to first be recognized as a viable subject. So this lens is kind of being used to interrogate these social structures and processes that exist within the politics and conditions of indigeneity. So, but yet I'm wanting to reorient this line of thought and this line of inquiry away from this kind of sole individuation of the human subject, which is arguably a critical goal of the colonial and settler colonial projects, which is, as Patrick Wolf talks about, and instead wanting to reconsider this space through the lens of indigenous livable life that's in relation to their community as a viable subject. So by shifting, or rather by making that leap, or making that move, that analytical move, what I'm wanting to do is, this reformulation project really wants to explore really what can be thought as intelligible indigenous existence by interrogating the politics and conditions that condition the interdependent singularities between individual and collective indigenous subjectivities. So, translation, I'm wanting to think about how not only the individuality of native life, but how that is intimately connected to their communities. Right? How being native and being indigenous in this space is very much a part of maintaining those connections to your community, and at the same time that community itself being the constitution of these individuals, and so how that relates into these broader social spaces that we currently inhabit. So by shifting our analytical focal point to the very kind of conceptual pillars of this idea of intelligible indigenous existence, what comes into focus is really the scholarly need to reintegrate minoritarian existences and discourses back into the political ontology of indigeneity. So instead of indigeneity kind of being this space that is solely a political space, where I think this effort is wanting to look at is how we need to talk about these ideas of race, ideas of ethnicity, ideas of sexuality and gender minorities within indigenous communities themselves. So one of the kind of a really prime example that I'm wanting to share with you all is in part of my work at in regards to the Santa Fe Indian School. And so particularly this project is looking at how ABQ youth were being enrolled and expelled at the Indian schools between 1890 and 1940, or late 1890s and 1940. And so, in fact, what I'm wanting to talk about is what I'm calling these OIA raids for alleged Mexicans that are in the Indian schools. And so in 1893, Indian school administrators begin a strategic policy of targeting alleged Mexicans that are in the schools. And in this case, it's rather phenomenal because I don't know if you guys can see on the right there, but official Indian school records only show that for these students that were being disenrolled, so they're being expelled. So as students, if they were getting transferred to other Indian schools, or if they were getting sent home, or whatever, if they had to go back for whatever reason, if they had to leave for any reason at all, Indian school administrators had to document it. And so in this case, we only see these administrators saying that they were taken home by the supervisor. So how am I making that assertion that it's targeting alleged Mexicans here? It was actually through a series of letters that were published by Joanne Ruckman in 1981 in the New Mexico Historical Review they were actually the letters of a teacher named W.F. Howard. And Mr. Howard was a brand new teacher here in Santa Fe, 1890. I think he comes in 1891, 1892. So he's has this huge culture shock. He's trying to figure out what the heck is going on over here in Santa Fe. And so he's writing to his querida, or to his wife back east, and he identifies these roughly over 20 children that get expelled for being white or Mexican. So, and so I had trouble trying to find this, but this is the only sort of reference to that expulsion, where and I've left the last names to kind of look at these different families, but essentially each of these children had Spanish first names and surnames, and more importantly, if these students weren't from border communities of federally recognized pueblos, they were from federally recognized pueblos themselves. So we had in instances where actually tribal citizens are getting rounded up in these OIA raids for Mexicans. Now, the very next year, that happens again, where you have Indian school administrators looking for who is supposed to be there in this case, so looking for Mexicans in this case, and they're looking for who isn't. And so, and in this case, Indian school administrators are rather explicit about wanting to target Mexicans. So in this case, in these discharge records, we have these children being too much Mexican for the reason that they're getting expelled. And again, we have many more reasons for, again, too much Mexican, too much Mexican. We have others that are running away because they were Mexican. And so here's one that shows Indian school administrators being rather colorful in their descriptions, where they're saying, happy riddance, perfectly worthless, too much Mexican. Another one saying, they must have anticipated the fate of the rest of the Mexicans, gotten rid of about this time, had been condemned. And finally, we have one that was able to go home, but they didn't let him back in. And it was okay because they were half Mexican anyways. Now, this is probably one of the most visceral examples of these raids, if you will, against alleged Mexican students, where you have a 7-year-old boy being instructed by the department to get rid of his Mexican blood. To get rid of his Mexican blood. So to me, that raises so many questions. And Indian school administrators don't clarify what constitutes Mexican in this case. But it's clear that what what they're arguing is that Mexicanness is incompatible with Indianness in New Mexico. That you can't be Mexican and be Pueblo or be Native at the same time. You have to be one or the other. And so really it's almost like a genuflection to what the identity politics of that time were, where you have a lot of elites trying to make New Mexico more palatable to the U.S. In the run-up to statehood. But I can't help but think about how this resonates with, how that really famous Richard Pratt saying when in the 1870s when he was talking about the Carlisle Indian School, where he says to kill the Indian and save the man. And in New Mexico, it ends up becoming in this time where it's kill the Mexican and save the Indian. Interestingly enough, ABQ children they enroll in the school roughly 4 years after these policies of targeting Mexicans. So one can argue that Indian school administrators were very conscious about wanting to weed out who was Mexican and who was Indian by this time. But the difference with ABQ children, by and large, was that they were being identified just as being Pueblo, versus where you have other Indian school administrators talking about it being specific to the Pueblos that they came from. So you have Jemez, you have, I think there's, not in this example, but you even have them going as far into detail as talking with Laguna, for example, where they would identify a child as being from Laguna, but they would even go even more specific into the community that they were from. So if they were from Mesita or Paguate, the point is that administrators were very meticulous about wanting to identify where these kids were coming from. And yet when it came to ABQ, there's this like resounding silence. And these are probably one of the most fascinating examples where in my archival work, I found in this register of pupils this massive document, but essentially where these enrollment records of ABQ children where they were not included in other spaces where Native kids were being put. In fact, where you have these documents actually being secreted, where you have, I would argue, where administrators or someone, maybe it was an administrator, maybe it wasn't, but someone stuffed these documents into the back of this book. And these are the only ways of ABQ's kind of initial sorts of entrances into the Indian school. So in this case, we have a Martinez boy. It says the father is dead. The boy has 1/8 Indian blood. But then this individual, and I'll kind of go into who I think it is, but all the original settlers of ABQ were full-blooded Pueblo Indians. In the course of time, though, they have become citizens by intermarriage with Spaniards and Mexicans. Again, that binary between Mexicanness and Indianness is very, very much apparent. But what's fascinating is to see who, and I believe that who wrote that first document was none other than Amado Chavez, who was the superintendent of public instruction, the first superintendent of public instruction in the territory of New Mexico. So Amado Chavez was very influential in kind of the development of public education in New Mexico, and yet in this letter he writes to the superintendent of the Indian school, he says, yeah, I have another boy for you from ABQ. And so it ends up being who is 1/2 blood Indian. So you have these very conflicting narratives that are going on in terms of what constitutes Mexicanness, what constitutes Indianness, and how ABQ children are kind of being, and they're navigating these very complicated racial and indigenous spaces in this way. But that leads me to this idea, to the second kind of conceptual signposts of belonging. And the way, and of course, I mean, there's a very well-grounded kind of foundation of scholarship that's talking about this, that's been funded a lot by SAR. So we have Keith Basso, Stephen Feld. But what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to kind of to read that and to put that discourse into dialogue with those discourses that exist here in New Mexico. So particularly, I'd like to talk about belonging through the lens of querencia. or what a really phenomenal Nuevo Mexicano intellectual, Juan Esteban Arriano, talks about as that which gives us a sense of place, which anchors us to the land and makes us a unique people. But of course, me being me, I have to complicate the hell out of everything, right? So I'm wanting to talk about how, in this idea of querencia, of this idea of ethnic territoriality. So I referenced it a little while ago, talking the tricultural myth. And it's actually Silvia Rodriguez, so another SAR alum, who develops this idea of ethnic territoriality, where she connects it to the tricultural myth, where essentially, if you're from New Mexico, you're taught, that in New Mexico only 3 peoples exist here. You have white people, you have Hispanics, and you have Native peoples, and they all live in harmony with one another, and everyone's best of friends. But joking aside, I mean, that narrative actually has a lot of political clout and is very integral and very imperative in understanding the trajectory of this region in terms of U.S. state formation. So in looking at ethnic territoriality in New Mexico, I'm wanting to look at these variegated, complicated, really competing claims to place and identity, which remain filtered through this master narrative, or I think what Chris Wilson calls it's like a public ideology here in New Mexico. But to put that master narrative within which region-based articulations of citizenship and belonging must be filtered through. And so my interest in belonging is kind of looking at the political affect of querencia. I'm wanting to look at how expressions of belonging to the New Mexico homeland can be at once in tension with and yet imbricated in colonial, tribal, and settler state power. So the 2 examples I have for you today is really awesome pictures. So the first one on the left one is a float that was done by the Pueblo, but this is actually at the fiestas in Española I believe it was in the late 1970s. I still need to kind of pin down the specific date. But I don't know if you can see what the sign reads on the front, but it says Genízaros de Abiquiu, 1892, quote, Indian captives, end quote. So you have these articulations, and then on the right, you have the phenomenal Genízaro scholar, who I would argue that he is probably one of the most, if not the most important Genízaro intellectual of the 20th century, el difunto Dr. Benito Cordova. And he has this map in his book but he labels it as Genízaro country. As Genízaro country. So these ideas of spatiality, these ideas of Genízaro spaces, which aren't necessarily in conflict with Pueblo, because if we look at what I believe he was referencing was, I don't know if you guys read the Rio Grande Sun in Española, but kind of like the header that they have is from the heart of Pueblo country. And so here we have a Genízaro scholar, and we have Genízaro elders talking about it as Genízaro country as well. So these things that aren't overlaying Genízaro ideas of space, because he even identifies San Juan or the Pueblo Boquehuingue as its own space, and yet they're talking about what it means to belong in this region that tells us that we don't belong. And yet there seems to be this dissonance between these contemporary articulations of Genízaro presences and then in relation to kind of the very overt political and legal machinations to essentially disrupt those articulations. So we have and I won't read the entire documents for you here, but the document on the left is the transcription of the land grant that was given by that was created by Governor Tomás Vélez Cachupín, and in that he talks about Indios Genízaros. It's always talked about as Indios Genízaros, and that this land grant was created under the same legal mechanisms that create the Pueblo Boquehuingue, that create the Pueblo Santa Ana, Jemez. I mean, they are created as a distinct Pueblo, like their Pueblo peers, except it is a Genízaro Pueblo. It's different from its other neighbors. But on the document on the right is a translation that comes from the U.S. Surveyor General's office in 1885, which translates Genízaros to be half-breed Indians, converted Indians, or converted half-breed Indians. And that's very important because once the government makes that claim to half-breededness or to mixedness, then it kind of takes the government off the hook. And so where we have in their land claims, or in the adjudication of their land grant in 1894 by the Court of Private Land Claims, again, I'm not going to read it for you, but I want to kind of point right here is say, which consisted of converted half-breed Indians. Which consisted of converted half-breed Indians. And not only did it consist of converted half-breed Indians, but it, in that way, it takes the government off the hook from having to utilize political and probably a very strenuous kind of legal project to figure out what this pueblo consisted of. So the resonances of these ideas then translate into a partition case in 1919 where you have, and again, I wish I could have blown this up more for you, but it's essentially, it's re-invoking these ideas of converted half-breed Indians, and by extension, that because of their mixedness, they have no right to be claiming an indigenous existence today, or in that time, and which extends to today. So at the same time that we have these very overt kind of articulations of existence that are going on within ABQ, we have equally important ones that are happening in Branchos, where I'm from. And so I want to kind of put a little bit of a spin on this, where I'd like to talk about the llanero. Now, the llanero, this picture does a really good job of talking about it, but Dr. Enrique Lamadrid's book in Hermanitos Comanchitos, he kind of first identifies this as a musical genre, and I would agree with that, but I'm kind of wanting to take it in a different direction. So he's talking about it as this way, as a form that's very that's defined by this slow cadence of the drum beat, and so growing up in these spaces, listening to these songs, and listening to these stories of our elders, this space became something very different for me, where, in fact, and again, so you see, let me see if I can get that. There we go. So that strapping young lad right there, on the far left end of the truck bed, that's me. That's me sitting with my primos and with the other dancers as we're celebrating our feast day. This photo was taken in front of the capilla in Talpa. But growing up and being in these spaces right here, there were fascinating conversations that were happening. Yeah, so you'd have, me and my primos would be debating who was the best professional wrestler, or who was our favorite football teams, and then you have these dancers lining the sides. Primarily those are the older dancers, and so they'd be talking about, oh yeah, that's where my tatarabuelita lived, or that's where my tia lives now, or that's the acequia where we used to hand fish in. And so for me, the llanero was these profoundly intimate expressions of everyday existence in a space where, again, we're told we're not supposed to belong to. And yet, in this llanero, the way our elders talk about it is these were songs that were sung as our antepasados, or as our ancestors were traveling from the llano to Taos, or so from the plains to Taos, or as they were traveling. So it was a way for our ancestors to connect back home when we were away. So we were always home when we were singing these songs, and so these songs then get passed down from generation to generation, and a lot of times the melodies and the tonadas are family specific, and yet they continue to be passed down. I guess if I can leave anything, kind of a last thought here, is that this work is not kind of this idea of it's not trying to make these claims to kind of the definition of Genízaros or the definitive work on Genízaros, but it's wanting It's wanting to put a Genízaro voice in a space where we haven't had a voice. And in this way, the llanero, to me, is a way to be in dialogue with our ancestors, to be in dialogue with our antepasados, and to be able to perpetuate that knowledge and to be a good ancestor for my descendants. And so that's, if I can leave that anything, that's my work is intimately grounded in wanting to remember and to perpetuate these memories and these histories and these experiences that are part of who I am. So thank you. So our feast day is on New Year's Day, and we dance from sunup to sundown. So when we've done our dances, I mean, the past several years, actually I think it was a couple of years ago, it was -13 when we started dancing, but we're out there. That's what we do. That's part of how we celebrate it. And so so we start up from sunup to sundown, and we're traveling all across the Taos Valley in this case. It's interesting because there aren't very many people who come to see our feast days. Kind of the focal point is Taos Pueblo, which is important. You know, I'm not to dismiss what the really beautiful dances that they have going on that day, but so you're more than welcome to come and join us. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of, we haven't really had that kind of a crowd, if you will. So yeah, and I think, and then in the Pueblo of IBQ, they have their feast days. So they have two feast days. Their first one is their Spanish feast day, which is the Santa Rosa, which is in August. And then they have their Indian feast day, which is the Santo Tomas, which is, I think, the Saturday after Thanksgiving. So yeah, I mean those, yeah, and they're beautiful. It's beautiful music, and it's just a beautiful space to be in. So I was the one who redacted those documents, and the reason why I did that was because I'm still working with, and I came across a new set of documents that kind of that complicate and clarify the arguments that I'm making, but I feel I have a responsibility at least to acknowledge the families that are being sent to these schools. And so in this way, when I go back to the Pueblo and I present on this work, I always try to make sure that they're able to see as much as I can possibly give them at that moment. And I also want to make sure that I'm doing my due diligence in terms of ensuring that my analysis is taking everything into account. So so that was a very conscious effort on my part. But I also, again, like I said, I wanted to also acknowledge that who these families are and their connections to this community.
Were you protecting the privacy?
Well. Yeah, well, yes and no. I think, yes, in protecting privacy, but I also, again, according to the IRB speculations, because this is so far back, I don't necessarily have to do that, but I've kind of taken it upon myself to do that. So, at least within the work that I've done and being able to kind of, because in these earlier stages, enrollment records weren't being produced as they were, like, say, in like the late, in like 1910s and 1920s. So the only really, the focal point that I have was this register, this massive, massive book. But a lot of times these kids were being identified, and so through the lens of blood quantum. So if they were half, if they were considered half, or if they were 1/4, then by and large, these are the same kids that were getting targeted, except and there were several instances, and I wish I could have elaborated on initially, but where children who were being identified and verified by Indian agency officials and Indian school administrators as full-blooded, which again is a colonialist construct that continues to be enforced upon Native people, so it's completely it's completely problematic to be looking at it through this lens. But still, if we're wanting to talk about government agencies utilizing these spaces to define Indianness, right, then you had these kids who were being identified as full-bloods getting equally targeted in the same way. So that's why I was kind of saying, like, when it comes to Mexicanness, like, Indian school administrators, I think, strategically did not define it. But at the same time, we have these clues into seeing that as Mexican blood. So something that can be shed can equally be acquired in this way, right? So maybe perhaps Mexicanness in this way means linguistic practice. Perhaps it means being a good Catholic. I don't know, but there are these clues that we can kind of tease it out in a way. By this time, Pueblo citizenship was still up in the air. It was still up in the air until 1913 with U.S. v. Sandoval. So like Indian school administrators had like a really, they had to navigate really complex spaces because on one end, you had these shifting Supreme Court rulings that were saying, oh, well, Pueblos are Indians, or no, they aren't Indians. And so when I'm talking about indigeneity, it's primarily getting read through the lens of Pueblos, right? New Mexico-specific indigenous existence is being read through Pueblo indigeneity. And so, so Pueblo citizenship was kind of up in the air, but you had Pueblos equally, and I think John Graham's his recent book, I think it's called Negotiating Conquest, but he specifically looks at how Pueblos they had a lot of political clout in these spaces where a lot of tribal nations didn't. So he's talking about how Pueblo governors were able to negotiate with Indian school officials so that Pueblo students could go back to the Pueblo during the summers and to go back for feast days and stuff like that. But these kids in ABQ kind of had they were in this really weird spot where like, you can't find them in tribal census records. There's no kind of an official Indian document to talk about these kids as Native, except where you have these families and youth articulating Native existences in this Native-centric space. So this is one of the very few kind of instances where we see ABQ kind of being considered in this way. But later on, it ends up kind of being read as the antithesis of indigeneity. So it's a complicated question. When it comes to kind of the contemporary sort of politics of tribal recognition, those conversations are happening. They're happening in the Pueblo of ABQ, and they're happening in Branchos in a different way. And it's kind of an ongoing thing. However, I will say that whenever that discussion has come up, there's kind of been this immediate knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, well, they just want to build a casino. Oh, it's just economic opportunism. When in fact, they're just asking the question. It's and so and of course, in the Española Valley, you have the saturation of tribal gaming, right? So of course, I mean, it's a very complicated discussion, but they are happening. I think each of these communities is kind of approaching that discussion in very different ways, and yet. I've been very blessed to be in these spaces where Genízaro elders from ABQ and from Branchos de Taos are able to talk with one another and engage with one another as Genízaros. It's not like I'm more Genízaro than you, or I have this or whatever. It's you have your history and we have ours. You have your experiences and we have ours, and we're still Genízaro, and we can kind of respect those differences while still appreciating ourselves as Genízaro peoples. It's interesting the ways in which that idea of choice gets elaborated when it comes to Genízaro identity. It's actually been something that's been leveled against me quite a bit by Native scholars in particular, that I chose to be Genízaro. And in this way, I think that narrative pops up in ABQ in a very profound way, where there's kind of these oral histories of where the Pueblo had to choose whether to be Hispanic or whether to be an Indian Pueblo. And so that was kind of that's another aspect of my dissertation, one of these chapters. But what's more interesting is that idea that in these spaces where they have choice, is at these same moments is where you have government policy essentially consolidating and crystallizing what it means to be Native. And of course, those policies being grounded very much in northern New Mexico. I mean, northern New Mexico, and particularly Pueblo nations, are very integral in understanding kind of the history and legacy of federal Indian policy in New Mexico. So so that question of kind of choosing whether or not we wanted to be Indian, ABQ has a very distinct kind of history where you have it's grounded in the land. It's grounded in the land and their land grant, right? And in Branchos, it's a completely different discussion. Yet, again, they're not mutually exclusive to one another. When it came to ABQ children, these flows of kids was really fascinating because, and this is the document that I came across, was essentially, I got to see these resonances of the public schools in Rio Arriba County that really has never been touched before. No one, and so in this case, finding census records of students that were aged 5, or children that were aged 5 to 21 between 1890 and 1940 within the pueblo itself. And so now, like, I'm able to kind of see these flows of these kids getting sent to the Indian schools, getting kicked out, being re-enrolled in the public schools, and then, interestingly enough, I found several instances, or many instances actually, where the kids in these families, they just wait out the superintendent, and they wait out until the next one came, and they'd re-enroll. And so they get kicked out again, and then they go back. It was this very tenacious idea that's really, I think, really speaks a lot. So the public schools in Rio Arriba County, particularly in ABQ, a lot of them were they were 3 months. Their school terms were their school years were 3 months out of the year. There's a lot to kind of unpack in terms of who is accessing these schools, and at the same time, again, how you had these political elites trying to undermine the capacity for ABQ to articulate an indigenous existence and within an indigenous space, and yet at the same time, like, kind of using kind of state kind of institutions in order to do that. So ABQ, I had an elder tell me that ABQ is a miracle. It is a miracle because they've had so many of these things that have gone against them. So many of these, rather systemic kind of dismissals of their existences, and yet they're there. They're doing that. They're singing the Naniye. It is. Like I said, I'm very blessed to be able to work in that community. Thank you.